Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first Hunter build of Episode Heresy, and it's one I'm really excited to share with you because it's become my go-to build for Hunter for pretty much any level of content. This is a build perfectly capable of soloing Master and Grandmaster level content, and is something I am 100% using for any solo runs or solo content I do in the near future. Some brief highlights of the build include having over 90% damage resistance, as well as having some insane ability regen and offensive potential when combined with Bolt Charge. Not only that, but this build has a ton of customization, so you can fit this out to be the perfect build for you if you want to. We have a lot to cover today, so let's get right into the subclass. Starting off on Arc Strider, for your super, you can really go with any of the three that are available. I personally like going with Arc Staff just because of its recent changes with the super regen increase, as well as having some increase to its damage against champions, means that this can hit very hard in general PvE content. However, if you have a boss focus encounter or need something for boss DPS, Gathering Storm is another great option. There's also some increased utility with Gathering Storm because a lot of our damage resist and survivability comes from jolting targets, and since Gathering Storm automatically jolts on hit whenever it's cast, you can get some raw utility and survivability while also investing into some DPS potential. If you really wanted to, you could also use Storm's Edge for whatever reason, so just keep that in mind, I guess. But primarily, Arc Staff for generalized content, Gathering Storm for boss DPS focused environments. Onto your abilities. Your first ability is Gambler's Dodge, which refreshes your melee charge when you use this near an enemy. For us, this is going to be primarily with Ascension, and I'll go over that a little bit later, but just keep in mind, this is basically a free way to instantly regen our melee charge. That melee ability is going to be Combination Blow, which has a much shorter cooldown compared to Disorienting Blow. In truth, you can use either of the two for this build, but again, that shorter cooldown really helps out with the regen effects for this build. For your grenade, it's really up to you for what you use with this build. I personally enjoy using Storm Grenades, that's what I'm using, but in truth, whichever grenade you are comfortable using to jolt targets is the best grenade for you. We're primarily pairing it with Spark of Shock, again to apply that jolt on hit, so whichever grenade you find works best to jolt targets is going to be the best grenade for you. For your aspects then, the first one we're going with is Ascension, and Ascension got a lot of indirect buffs recently. Basically, whenever you're in the air, you activate your class ability and you're thrusted upwards, jolting nearby targets and becoming amplified. Again, the jolting effect plays into the survivability with this build alongside our exotic, but the amplified effect is also very nice. Recently, Amplified got a rework where it basically gives you a small amount of damage resistance and also makes you harder to hit. Kind of like Manticore's in air effect, but basically all the time while you're amplified. So in the past where Amplified didn't really give you any kind of value in PvE, Amplified now gives you a small amount of damage resistance and makes you harder to hit, which means Ascension is really strong because it gives you that on demand without needing a kill or even any damage ticks to activate it. We're also combining this with Tempest Strike, which replaces our melee charge when we slide. This will then cast an AoE jolting wave that launches us upwards, which we can use Ascension out of the air from using Tempest Strike, and also any jolted targets that are then killed by Tempest Strike also give us a free stack of Bolt Charge, which again have its own host of benefits I'll cover later. The other thing that Tempest Strike does that it isn't directly stated here is it also gives you a 75% damage resistance for 4 seconds after using Tempest Strike. Normally 75% damage resistance is fundamentally broken in PvE because that's such a large amount of damage resistance and you can take so much damage that having that active all the time would normally be too strong. The thing with this build is we're spamming our melee as often as possible, and so we're more often having that 75% damage resistance than we aren't. And again, that damage resistance stacks with stuff like Amplified, it stacks with our base damage resistance, it stacks with our exotic effect, which gives us even more damage resistance when we jolt targets, as well as stuff like Spark of Resistance, which gives us even more damage resistance. So going off of the base subclass then, you can already see the kind of general gameplay loop for this build. It's just mainly spamming our abilities as much as we can, jolting as many targets as possible, and building into our survivability. In short, the more aggressive you are with your gameplay, the better your survivability becomes. We're also pairing this again with Spark of Resistance for our first fragment, giving us more damage resistance when we're surrounded by combatants, which again stacks with everything else I went over. We also have Spark of Frequency, which the main effect that this gives us is doubling our Bolt Charge stacks when we're amplified. Again, with how strong Bolt Charge is this season and how easy it is to get with this build in general, doubling our Bolt Charge stack gains basically means that we can generate a lot more damage very quickly with this setup. And normally the requirement of being amplified can be a bit hard to trigger, but again, since amplified happens basically on demand with Ascension and we're getting it back so quickly anyway, it's very easy to take advantage of Spark of Frequency. Again, we're pairing it with Spark of Shock to let our arc grenades jolt targets, and we're also using Spark of Focus to increase our class ability regen while we're sprinting. Normally this is a PvP ability, but with this build, since we're already being so aggressive with our gameplay and sprinting so much, it's a very easy way to get a quick burst of class ability regen alongside all the other ability regen this build focuses on. And of course, investing into our class ability then intrinsically gives us our melee back, which means that we can spam Ascension and Tempest Strike a lot faster, building into our survivability, jolting more targets, etc, etc. And then the final fragment is Spark of Amplitude, which rapidly defeated targets will give us all the power when we're amplified. This basically gives us a free orb of power every 10 seconds because again we're always amplified with this build. In truth, Spark of Amplitude is really just here for quality of life, so if you'd want to swap this out for another fragment to better fit your playstyle, you can absolutely do that. So recommendations include stuff like Spark of Haste to also give you some more stat bonuses along with the class ability regen while you're sprinting, or even stuff like Spark of Magnitude if you want to rock a grenade that specifically benefits from this fragment. But again, the 5th fragment is really up to you. Onto the artifact. There are 3 primary mods that really help make this build what it is, and so I'm going to primarily focus on those 3 artifact mods and then go into the other ones I'd recommend using based on the weapons you want to use with this build and the content you're bringing this build into. Starting off first, we have Defibrillating Blast. Defibrillating Blast will grant you maximum stacks of Bolt Charge when you stun a champion, and it also triggers a strike that jolts targets and heals you. Something this mod doesn't tell you though is that anytime you trigger a Bolt Charge strike, it will heal you, meaning you don't have to stun a champion to receive that effect. And because of that, this is a very easy way to get a ton of health if you're building into Bolt Charge effectively. And again, with this build, we're getting a ton of Bolt Charge effects, so it's very, very valuable. We're also pairing this with Flashover, which allows those Bolt Charge strikes to deal over 150% more damage, which at base, they're dealing just shy of 40,000, and with Flashover active, they're dealing around 90,000 damage, which is a ton even stuff like a Grandmaster Nightfall or Master level content. So it's absolutely something you should be taking advantage of, regardless of what build you're using if you have a way to take advantage of Bolt Charge. This also allows us to become amplified whenever we get maximum stacks of Bolt Charge, so for whatever reason, if we needed to, this is another way for us to activate Amplify. And the final core mod is going to be Dielectric, which anytime we defeat an arc debuff target, it grants you an additional stack of Bolt Charge, which using these other 2 mods, it's very easy to see why that's strong. But in addition, the activity boost is very nice with this build. Basically, anytime you defeat an arc debuff target, it'll heal you and generate an orb of power, which again plays into the survivability of this build and allows you to be a lot more aggressive, which of course then allows you to jolt more targets and generate a lot more stacks of Bolt Charge, which again deal more damage and heal you, so on and so forth. These 3 mods here are key behind making this build what it is, and no matter which way you customize it, these 3 help with not only increasing its overall damage and bolt stacking potential, but also helping jolt targets a lot more efficiently and get more rewards for killing those jolted targets, increasing its survivability immensely. As far as other mods to run with this build, for generalized gameplay, which is mainly where I'm using this build in, I would recommend going with Heavy Ordnance Regeneration, specifically with an Arc or Void LMG. I'll get into why that is in a second. But basically, dealing damage with an LMG will periodically grant you increased grenade and melee regen, as well as a little bit of damage resistance, which again stacks with everything else I went over, and is why this build is so incredibly tanky despite being an offensive-based build. Again, I'm primarily using an Arc LMG, but if you wanted to use a Void LMG, there is a reason to do so, primarily with Volatile Marksman and Maligned Harvest. Summarized, Volatile Marksman is going to give you free volatile rounds after getting precision hits or final blows with a Void weapon, and with the activity boost, those volatile detonations will also give you a chunk of class ability energy, which of course with this build means you get Ascension back faster and have the whole ability chain and survivability reset kept up a lot more often. This also plays off of Maligned Harvest, giving you basically free weakening with this build, which can mean that your lightning strikes from Flashover then deal more damage. Again, it's entirely dependent upon what you want to do, because most often those Arc LMGs have ways to build into Bolt Charge stacks or the jolting effects a lot more effectively than the Void ones, so there is a bit of a trade-off between the initial effects that happen. However, since both kinds of LMGs are benefiting the build through Heavy Ordnance Regeneration, they both naturally are going to increase the survivability at some point, as well as the ability regen overall. So realistically, if you wanted to use an Arc LMG, or a Void LMG, the build more or less functions the same, but has access to different effects or effects of a certain kind more often. And then finally, the other combination I'd recommend using is Particle Reconstruction, which Particle Reconstruction with this build is a very easy way to make any kind of fusion rifle or linear fusion rifle very strong by having its own intrinsic debuffing effect. Of course, most commonly, this pairs really nicely with stuff like Queenbreaker, which is kind of a meta pick this episode, and again, with something like Gathering Storm, automatically jolting targets over and over again. It's very easy to pair something like Gathering Storm with Queenbreaker and Particle Reconstruction, and this build still has the ability spam effects and survivability it's always had, but now it also has really good boss DPS potential. Again, it's entirely dependent upon what you want to do with this build and the activity you're taking it into. Just remember, the core 3 mods are Defibrillating Blast, Flashover, and Dielectric. Next up are the armor mods, the exotic armor, and the stat distribution for today. Starting off on our helmet, I'm going with a stack of Dynamo and a stack of Hands On. Dynamo is going to give us a chunk of super energy anytime we use our class ability near enemies, primarily with Ascension with this build, and Hands On is going to give us a chunk of super energy anytime we get melee kills, which again, having Tempest Strike as our melee is very easy to do. and especially since Ascension directly fills up our Tempest Strike charge, means that this combination is a very easy way to benefit our super a ton with this build. I'm also pairing it with a Harmonic Siphon mod, allowing my arc weapons to primarily generate orbs of power after getting a few kills. Again, depending upon the weapon you want to use, again, if you want to use a Void or Arc LMG, swap this out to best fit those weapons. For the gauntlets, I'm going with 2 stacks of Heavy Handed just to allow us to generate an orb of power every 5 seconds off of our powered melee, which is about how often I found ourselves spamming our melee ability with this setup when done properly. I'm also pairing it with a stack of Focusing Strike, just allowing us to have some increased class ability regen as we deal damage with our melee. So again, investing into our melee or investing into our class ability intrinsically benefits the other build, since our class ability gives us back our melee, and dealing damage with our melee generates class ability energy. Onto the chess piece, and the exotic for today is Gifted Conviction. Gifted Conviction is a very slept on exotic in my opinion, that I feel a lot of people are only recently discovering how strong this actually is. In short, when you use Ascension or Tempest Strike, it'll shoot out arc projectiles that jolt on hit. But the big selling point for Gifted Conviction is that any time that you jolt a target from any source, you get stacking damage resistance. It doesn't say here, but the damage resistance that you get with Gifted Conviction at maximum stacks is a 50% damage reduction for 10 seconds. And again, this jolting effect can come from any source, so it can come from your weapon, it can come from your super, it can come from your abilities, it can come from your bolt charge strikes. Any jolting effect of any kind intrinsically builds up your damage resistance, and when it max stacks, will refresh the duration of that damage resistance effect. And as you can see from the background gameplay, with an ability spam focus build like this one, it's very easy to have that 50% damage resistance basically up indefinitely with this build. This chest piece is incredibly fantastic, and it's why if you pair a jolting weapon with this build, it becomes so strong. As far as the mods on the actual chest piece go, you can really use any combination you want to. I normally suggest some combination of a reserve mod and resist mods. I do want to mention something though. If you're using this build in more generalized gameplay at a lower difficulty, say standard difficulty or legend difficulty, I wouldn't recommend using any resistance mods. And the main reason for that is damage resistance is a diminishing return based effect. You can't ever have true 100% damage resistance because that means you just wouldn't take damage. You would effectively be immune. So the closer you get to 100% damage resistance, the less and less you'll get from those damage resist effects. And so since we're already above 90% damage resistance in some cases with our other effects, these normal 15% bonuses from our resist mods become a lot smaller and aren't as noticeable. And so as a result, if you're in lower difficulty content, there's really no point to investing any more into resist with resist mods. So I would go with 3 reserves and benefit the weapon you're using to primarily support this build. And again, if you're in higher difficulty content, stuff like Master or Grandmaster Nightfalls, especially if you're in stuff like solo content, I would absolutely recommend still utilizing your resistance values, because in that kind of content, there really is no such thing as having too much damage resistance. Finally, onto the legs, I'm using 2 stacks of Absolution just to benefit our ability regen across the board every time we pick up an Orb of Power. And again, that Orb of Power can come from our Fragment mod giving us an Orb of Power every 10 seconds when we're amplified, or from our melee ability with Heavy Handed, or from our Siphon mod benefiting our weapons. In addition, anytime we pick up that Orb of Power, we also get free health from Recuperation, and this pairs nicely with our Cloak, which has 2 stacks of Powerful Attraction. Powerful Attraction is going to let us pick up that Orb of Power every time we use Ascension. 2 stacks will increase the range of that pickup radius. And then finally, in addition, I'm pairing Distribution with it, which initially using Ascension then gives us ability energy regen across the board. This combination works really nicely because, as you can see, using our class ability gives us energy, which then picks up nearby Orbs of Power on cast, which also gives us more ability energy, as well as health pickup. And in addition, using our class ability fully refunds our melee charge, which builds back into our class ability and congenital Orbs of Power, which give us all these other effects. Briefly touching on the stat distribution I would recommend using for this build, as always, resilience is your #1 priority. A free 30% damage resistance is fantastic, even with the other damage resistance sources we're stacking on top of this build. And then besides that, it's truly up to you depending upon which kind of option you're going with the build loadout. If you want to focus on stuff like getting your super back faster and you're using stuff like Gathering Storm, Intellect is definitely worth investing into a little bit more just to bring up that base cooldown. If you're using Arc Staff though, because of the super regen changes, Intellect isn't as worth investing. Besides that though, Strength is also a good thing to invest in, even though we can get it back very quickly and instantly via our class ability effect. It's very nice to have this available to regen itself pretty much instantaneously without having to rely on our class ability. So because of that, we can save it for some of the clips you're seeing in the background gameplay where we use our Tempest Strike, then activate Ascension, which instantly gives us Tempest Strike back. And of course, with that in mind, since we're having our melee ability back so quickly, it intrinsically builds back into our class ability regen. Onto the weapons I'd recommend using with this build. Primarily, any kind of arc weapon that has access to stuff like Volt Shot or Jolting Feedback. are the best weapons to use with this build. Any kind of jolting effect is going to activate the effects of Gifted Conviction, and that is going to increase the survivability this build has. So having an arc weapon that can do that either off of a kill or on hit is very powerful. Stuff like the Vesper's Host Auto Rifle is a staple for arc builds pretty much on any class, just because Attrition Orbs and Jolting Feedback is a monster of a roll, giving you free jolting effects and orb gen off of damage ticks. In addition, I like using Brigand's Law with this build because it has the combination of Pugilist and Bolt Shot, which fit in very nicely with this build, with Pugilist giving us ability energy for our melee every time we get a kill, and Bolt Shot rewarding us with a jolting effect after reloading after getting a kill. Besides that, we have our heavy weapon, which again is really dependent upon what you want to do with this build and any way that you want to take this setup for yourself. Primarily, the weapon of choice for me is Watchful Eye with one of two roles. The first perk I recommend getting is Wellspring, which gives you ability energy across the board every time you get a kill, and is very strong at supporting ability spam focused builds like this one. As far as the other perk I would pair with it, there are two options I would recommend. The first one is going to be Rolling Storm, which basically gives you free stacks of Bolt Charge on a kill, and this can be enhanced a lot further by being amplified. You get an additional stack of Bolt Charge, and with Spark of Frequency, you get another stack of Bolt Charge, which can mean you get 3 stacks of Bolt Charge every time you get a kill. And in addition, anytime that you don't have stacks of Bolt Charge and you get a kill with this weapon, it gives you another one, meaning off of a single kill, you can generate almost half of your Bolt Charge stacks. So a weapon like this is very, very powerful because it builds into the ability regen as well as the Bolt Charge effects, which have their own host of benefits. The other perk this can get is Jolting Feedback, which I went over earlier. I haven't been lucky enough to get that role on Watchful Eye, but in my opinion, that would be the god role for this weapon. However, though, there are a wide variety of perks this weapon can get that can support this class. You could also use a Void LMG if you wanted to, like the new Fog LMG if you have a good roll with that. Even something like Hammerhead, Retrofit Escapade, Commemoration, all are great Void LMGs. And again, these don't have to have crazy perk combinations on them if you don't have them, just because the artifact basically gives them free weakening and volatile effects. And again, with these Void LMGs, even though they're not arc-based intrinsically, you're still regenning the grenade and melee effects that can jolt targets, as well as regenning the class ability energy by causing volatile explosions. So again, to summarize, arc LMGs are very good at building up the jolting and bolt charge effects that have their own host of benefits, and the Void LMGs are good at building into ability regen as well, but also specifying class ability regen on top of it. And that's something that arc LMGs can't explicitly replicate in the same way. But both end up doing a very good job with this build, it just depends upon which one you prefer using. For exotics though, you can also use something like Thunderlord, which is kind of a no-brainer with Bolt Charge this season. And like I mentioned earlier, if you wanted to swap out the parts of the artifact perk, going with something like Particle Reconstruction over something like Heavy Ordnance Regeneration, you can use something like Queenbreaker for an easy long-range DPS option, and combine that with Gathering Storm for massive Bolt Charge stacking potential, raw utility through Jolting, and just overall really strong damage. As far as your kinetic slot, it's entirely up to you what you want to use. I felt that something like Watchful Eye and Brigand's Law was already strong enough on its own that I actually wanted to commit to using an exotic in my kinetic slot that I typically didn't use, which is Bastion. The main reason I'm picking Bastion is because of the perk Saint's Fist, which was actually reworked a while ago. Basically, anytime that you deal damage with your melee, this weapon gets a short 45% damage boost, which even in stuff like Grandmaster level content can absolutely chunk through champions, and it's something I personally have been having a lot of fun with this build. But again, you don't explicitly need to use Bastion with it, I just found it's actually a very fun exotic to pair with it. Besides that though, stuff like Tenacious Mastery is fantastic with this build because it can stagger all through champions this season with the artifact mod, but again, it's entirely up to you. So to summarize, again, any kind of jolting effect or class ability regen or bolt charge stacking effect is fantastic. LMGs in general are just great fits for this build, and there's a wide variety of those to choose from. But again, the customization this build offers, because so much is being taken care of intrinsically, means that this build has basically limitless customization to it, and is a perfect fit regardless of what kind of activity you're going into. All in all guys, that's the build for today. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, this has become my go-to hunter build for basically all kinds of content now, both master and GM content and solo content like Solo Sundered Doctrine for example, and it's one I've been having a blast with. Thank you so much for watching my build guide. I greatly appreciate your support on these videos. Dim link is down in the description below for this build. I hope you guys have as much fun with it as I've been having, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. I'm working on a few build guides already for Titan and Warlock, so stay tuned for those in the near future. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.